Welcome to the EQ Video Tip. I'm your host, Eric Forsetter. As always, it's a pleasure to have you back for another terrific show. Before we jump into this week's show, let's review the tips and goals of EQ Video Tip. What's on tap for today? Well, today's a terrific show, and it comes to us from James DeTert, who talks about phrases to avoid when having a difficult conversation. And it's often that we have these difficult conversations, whether at work, with family, with friends, and when you do that, you have to craft your message in a way that you're conveying your point while at the same time keeping other people's feelings in mind. And it's very hard to do that because their opinions, their feelings are their own, and it's something that you're going to have to take into consideration when having that. Let's jump into some of the great tips that James has for us right now. Tip number 1, don't assume your viewpoint is obvious and don't exaggerate. Many times we have a conversation with someone, we decide that we know exactly how the other person is, and we're positive that our view is the correct view. And not only the correct view, it's the view that everyone can see, when in fact, only we see it, only a few people see it. It's so important to realize that your perspective is just one perspective amongst hundreds, if not thousands, that are out there. So even though you think you have the right idea and everybody sees it, they may or may not see it. Additionally, avoid words like you always, you never, because people don't work in absolutes. They don't say you always make this mistake or you never listen to me. Maybe they don't listen, but even if they don't, there is a time and a point where they do listen to you. So make sure to avoid those absolutes, as well as don't assume that your viewpoint is easy for everybody to see and so on. Tip number 2, don't tell others what they should do. Nobody likes to hear what they can do. Think about it. Even when you were a kid or a toddler, you didn't want to hear from your parents, you need to do your laundry, you need to clean up the dishes. Nobody likes to be told what to do. It's just the way of life. Instead, you may want to consider statements like, you may want to consider, or have you thought of, or one possibility is this, or have you thought of doing this in this manner? It increases your odds of having a persuasive conversation, and more importantly, it puts the person at ease as opposed to saying, you need to do this, or in other words, you ought to do this, or stupid, why didn't you think of this? Instead, try to use statements that give an option to the person, where they have the chance to think about what you're offering them and make a conclusion that this is the right way to go, as opposed to they need to do it as well. Tip number 3, don't blame others for your feelings. Your feelings are appropriate, of course they are, but just because someone does something to make your feelings anger or happy or sad doesn't mean you can blame them one way or the other. For example, if a colleague always interrupts you, you can't say in the middle of that, hey, you're doing this, it makes me so angry. Because people don't like to be blamed for things. If you blame them for something, it's just going to get them on the defensive and you're going to get a fight. Instead, what you might want to do is you could say, hey, when you interrupt me, it makes me feel disrespected, it makes me feel hurt. Could you please not do that? It's a different way of doing it, a different tone, and could you please not interrupt me till I'm finished? Something like that will convey a much better tone that your intentions are there to work with that person, as opposed to starting a conflict where you're saying, hey, I'm blaming you for something that you did all the time. Next tip, don't challenge someone's character. Now, inadvertently, we challenge people's character by saying something like, hey, that's unprofessional, or that's wrong, or that's unethical. When you say that, you're questioning their judgment and the way they actually act, because you're putting something on them that says, hey, you're acting in an inappropriate way, and you have bad judge of character, and your character is not that great. Instead, you might want to say something like, hey, this doesn't align with our mission, or the mission of our customer, or what we're trying to accomplish here. It's much better to do it that way, that rather than labeling it as unprofessional, because it changes the way people look at how you're talking to them, and it will not undermine their trust in you as well. last tip, and I love this one. Don't say it's not personal, because guess what? When you're talking to someone and they're clearly hurt or emotional or have feelings, whether it's anger, sadness, whatever it might be, telling them it's not personal is just throwing salt on a wound, because it is personal to them. They actually are impacted by it. They feel personally disrespected, upset, anger, whatever it might be. What you could do, in fact, is actually acknowledge that you care and say, well, it may not be personal to me. I can tell that it actually is personal to you and you're affected by this and you care about that. And so it's important to acknowledge that and hopefully diffuse the situation, as opposed to say, nothing personal, but I just dropped this load of criticism on you or something else. It's important to acknowledge that, because you're acknowledging their feelings as well as your own. And in doing so, it's going to make you a more emotionally intelligent person to understand what's happening with them and diffuse a situation that may or may not lead into more conflict in itself. That's a wrap for this week's EQ video tip. Hopefully you liked these different tips that we had this week. Of course, make them your own, use them in your day-to-day life, and especially as you're having conflict, think about the phrases you want to use and utilize to help reduce that conflict going forward. So that concludes our EQ video tip for today. Try incorporating some of these tips into your daily routine. But remember, use what works best for you and personalize it for yourself. Thank you always to our great research team for providing us with some great tips today. As always on EQ Video Tip, we want to end with gratitude. So thank you for watching. We really appreciate it. Here are some resources that you can use if you want more information on EQ going forward. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you.